Ankita, we can start now.
Thank you, Shreya. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar on the recent ruling of ICICI Econet Internet and Technologies Fund. This ruling has been issued by the Bangalore Tribunal of CESTAT. And this ruling potentially has a lot of large implications for various kind of trusts which have been set up in India. So I'll give you a gist of what this ruling is all about, and then I'm going to pass on the baton to my colleagues who will then further discuss the judgment. So as you know, any startup needs a huge financial support, and presently this is being done by alternative investment funds or venture capital funds. Now, these funds are pooled investment vehicles with a certain set of contributors. In India, typically these funds are in the form of trusts established under the Indian Trust Act 1882. Now, under the common practice, these funds do not issue any invoice for payment of service tax or GST from contributors. Now, what the latest judgment from the Bangalore CESTAT has done is that it has opened this debate again by confirming service tax demand in the hands of a VCF trust while making the following observations. The first observation which it made was that VCFs have an independent entity and a distinct personality of their own. The activities of the VCFs of distributing dividends and other amounts to the respective unit holders were clearly mentioned in the private placement memorandum and other scheme documents, which evidence the profit motive of the VCFs. Number two, the CESTAT held that the VCS violated the principle of mutuality by concerning themselves in commercial activities and by using their discretionary powers to benefit a certain class of investors. Number three, the carried interest is neither interest nor returns on investment as claimed by the fund, but a portion of the consideration retained by the VCFs for the services they render to the investors and passed on in the guise of return on investment to Class C unit holders. And number four, the funds devised the structure in such a manner that the IM and or their nominees would receive huge sums of money in the guise of the performance fee carried interest, with the twin motive of benefiting the IM and or the nominees at the expense of the subscribers and avoiding taxes. Now, this is basically the gist of the ruling. And now with that, let me introduce you to my fellow panelists and my colleagues. Amit Singhania from the direct tax practice of Shardullah Merchant Mangaldas. I have Abhishek Parekh, who's a partner in the general corporate practice and specializes in funds and all kinds of structures for AIFs in India. And I also have my colleague Ankita, who works in the indirect tax practice and regularly advises many funds and AIFs in their structuring activities. So over to you, Ankita, for a detailed discussion on this very, very important ruling.
Thanks, Rajat. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And, thank you so much for joining this webinar. I'm sure that all of us, who are present here today have read a lot about this recent ruling, which has sort of sent shockwaves through the industry. And therefore, we thought that instead of going really into what the facts were and what essentially has led to it, what we would try and do during the course of our discussion is sort of bring out the pain points that the industry is now, witnessing or will witness as a consequence of this ruling, and also probably sort of give you all pointers which one will need to keep in mind before and for choosing our next steps. Because really this ruling is a point of inflection, and by this ruling, we sort of unlearn not only what we've learned so far from the service tax regime, but also from the Trust Act, which is a way more dated legislation and a more specific piece of legislation, which is concerned. So with that, we prepared a small presentation that we'd like to share with you all. And I hope the presentation is visible to everybody.
Yeah, we can.
All right, great. So, before we go into as to what the tribunal really held in detail, of course, Rajat has given a summary. It's important to understand that this legislation, while it concerns the service tax regime, it also dates back to the period 2005 to about 2012. And it's interesting to note that the service tax regime itself during this particular point of time has undergone various changes. The changes being that initially, to start with, there was no definition of person under the service tax law. And subsequently, when there was a definition of person, the term, specifically the artificial person, trust, was included much later under the definition, right? So that's one thing that we all need to remember. And why I say that it's important is because unlike the service tax regime, the GST law already includes trust as under the definition of person. So it's important to note that while this ruling specifically is under service tax laws, but the potential exposure under the GST is probably higher, if not, and it is something that we all need to be mindful of, right? Now, any tax law, whenever there is a demand, there is an issue that, or what is basically targeted is that what is the base on which you are seeking to levy that tax? What is the taxable event, right? Once you justify that what is the taxable event, then you go on to see that if that taxable event is specifically covered under the provisions of the law, and there is a clear-cut category under which it is taxable. This again is important because if you all would recall, during the period 2005 till about 2012, India had a positive list of positive taxable regime, which basically meant that unless and until the services were covered under specific buckets, there could not be any tax, a service tax, which could be imposed on the same, right? So the second point is that what is the nature of this activity or service? The third is that, is there really a person on whom you want to, or the tax regulators have wanted to fasten this liability? And the fourth is that, and which is again something which was very, very important under the erstwhile regime, is that, is there a consideration which was really charged for it? Like we know, consideration is, is a concept that's been picked up from the Contract Act and has always held a very important place under the tax law, specifically the indirect tax laws, right? Now, the key arguments which essentially were made by the assessees in this case was that, first, that there was no service provider service recipient relationship between the trust and the funds, right? The second was that the fund or the trust did not charge any consideration for rendering these activities. Third, that even if there was an activity of sort of managing the investments, etc., it was per se not a specific positive service that was rendered by the trust structure. And fourth, like I said, that the trust is not a person at all, right? It does not have any sort of a different juridical presence under the provisions of law as they stood at that point of time. What did the tribunal really held? Like we know that, this issue went on for quite some time. It was an investigation which was initiated by the intelligence authority agencies, and thereafter, the matter was, there was an order in original which was appealed before CSTAT, and finally, the ruling, the negative ruling of CSTAT basically said four major things. One, it said that trust is a juridical person, and the basic premise on which they said that the trust had a separate legal existence, or it is a person, is because they said that we will not go into the definition of person under service tax laws. We will really have to rely on how, or what is the understanding of a common man, the common parlance test, so to say. And if we were to apply the common parlance test, we would say that a trust is a juridical person. They further said that, that common parlance test was essentially important in this case because the trust was registered with the service tax authorities. The trust was an income tax assessee. They had a PAN. They were paying, the respective income tax, etc., under the representative capacity, which of course, Amit would be delving on further. But and they did not really appreciate the difference between income tax and service tax. But they said that because trust was registered, they had a PAN, they were maintaining separate profit and loss statements, etc., it was held to be a juridical person. The second thing, and most importantly, what the tribunal did was they said that the doctrine of mutuality between the trust and its members did not apply. Now, this is a very, very interesting argument because it really changes how we've sort of understood the doctrine of mutuality so far. A lot has happened, that there are umpteen number of Supreme Court rulings wherein the court has time and again held that what are the factors which would be relied upon when you have to apply the doctrine of mutuality of interest. And this ruling, strictly speaking, does not adhere to those factors, does not adhere to those principles, because they said that the fund is not merely a conduit, which is what was argued by the assessee. They said that the fund was basically, the service provider, which was responsible for receiving the funds from the members. It was undertaking the KYC or due diligence of its members before it was accepting these funds. And the fund at the time of disbursing profits was not following the principle of equality. Now, when we say that it was not following the principle of equality, the primary argument of the department was that each fund had different class of investors, class A, class B, class C investors. And each of these classes had a specific or a defined proportion of profits or benefit that was to accrue to them at the time of disbursing the profits, right? They said the very fact that the waterfall mechanism that was followed by the trust sort of distinguished between what was the proportion that would be available to class A or class B or class C itself meant that the benefit was not distributed equally, and this essentially fractured the doctrine of mutuality of interest. And on this basis, they said that it cannot be argued or it cannot be said that the trust and its members are one and the same person. They are two separate, identities, right? The third point was that, and that was something that was, of course, argued by the assessee, that even if you say that it is, an activity which was undertaken by a service provider for a service recipient, there was no consideration which was charged by the trust, by its members, for undertaking the management of funds, etc. Right? And the tribunal at this point of time made a very interesting observation. What they said was that while we agree that no remuneration is specifically charged by the trust, from its members, however, there are certain expenses that the trust was sort of deducting before distributing the profit to the beneficiaries. And it is these expenses that the trust is incurring that is basically being retained from the total pool that will qualify to be consideration. And it cannot therefore be argued that there is no consideration for this, so to say, supply of service that was being made. The tribunal further said that any expenses that were deducted from the net asset value or any provisions which were made for various impairments and losses, the carry, like we understand, all of these three things, basically the broad categories, were held to be consideration, and it was held that they would, that it cannot be said that there is no benefit, there is no consideration which was charged by the trust, because this really was the consideration which was being retained. It may not be actively paid by the members, but it was something that was retained. The fourth aspect, what the tribunal, sort of passed a ruling on, was that this activity for which there is a consideration would qualify to be, or would get categorized under the positive category of banking and other financial services. Now, this is very important, because during the course of the ruling, what the tribunal really did was that they said that the function of a trust is really akin to that of a bank. Now, a bank, much like a trust, accepts deposits from its customers. It sort of manages the portfolios and manages the investments, and as and when they get some profit, etc., that is distributed. So they said that because the functioning of the trust was akin to that of a bank, the relevant category under the service tax law was banking and other financial services. Now, like I said, that this is basically what the department said, or what the tribunal held, and while confirming the demand. Now, let's sort of understand that from a tax standpoint, whether this ruling is, it sort of subscribes to the principles that we've sort of understood so far, and whether it really is in conflict with the more specific legislation, which is the trust and the SEBI legislation, which is the parent legislation, so to say, for these trusts. It's very interesting that the tribunal, while confirming this demand, has relied on certain basic clauses of the trust documentation to say that the trust is really a person which has an existence separate from its members. They've relied on clauses which say that the trust will have to undertake KYC or the due diligence for the members, and while doing so, in our opinion, they have not appreciated the fact that the trust industry is a very, very heavily regulated industry, right? It is something which is not something that's done out of the own sweet will of the trust. When they were doing the KYC norms, when they were doing the due diligence of the members, it was because they were mandated by another legislation to undertake this sort of basic health check of the members. And merely because they were undertaking KYC or due diligence for the members, does that make them a service provider? Likewise, they've said that a trust is a person because they are registered with the service tax authorities, because they are maintaining a profit and loss account. Now, this again is something which is very important, because a trust may be required or may be mandated by the law to have a PAN, to have a balance sheet, to report those numbers and figures. But does that mean that purely or only on the basis of these registrations, or only on the basis of the fact that a balance sheet was maintained, does that make them different from its members? While holding that they're a separate juridical person, and while also relying on the provisions of Income Tax Act, they have sort of somewhere blurred the line or blurred the understanding which flows from the income tax law, which says that a trust is also taxed in its representative capacity. It is by way of a deeming fiction that this trust is taxed under income tax law. So all of these factors are something that that were relied on by the tribunal. And in our humble opinion, with all due respect to the wisdom of the tribunal, they have seen the facts, they have seen the documentation, the trust documentation from a tax lens. But probably despite the fact that the provisions of the trust laws, the SEBI regulations, the PCF regulations, they have been discussed in the this over 100-page judgment, but probably those provisions have not been appreciated in the correct light or spirit. And that is the reason why I feel that this ruling has come up, a negative ruling has come up on this very, very complicated structure, because and sort of it unlearns, it wants us to unlearn or unsettle the practices what have been carried on by the industry. Another important thing that I'd like to highlight, and we'll speak about it a bit later as well, is the fact that even though this demand, is something that there is an interpretational issue which is involved in this case, whether such services or whether such activity would qualify to be a service under service tax law or not, they have still gone ahead and they have invoked the extended period of limitation. Now, this is something, it's a technical argument, but this is something that I think it should be considered by all of us when we are if we are faced with similar demands, because typically the rule regarding invoking the extended period of limitation is that when there is a willful suppression, when there is a fraud, etc., which is there, that the extended period of limitation is invoked. Now, in this case, the exact practice that was being followed by the trust was being declared in its in the SEBI, before the appropriate authorities. In fact, it was also before the income tax authorities. So how correct is the tribunal in invoking the extended period of limitation? That again is something that probably needs more deliberation. And while this decision is there, it's before us. In our view, this is not obviously the last word. And given the fact that it changes the way the entire industry functions and the exposure that it entails. So I'd like to invite Abhishek now, who specializes in VCF and trust regulations, who would and let's hear Abhishek's perspective as well as to whether the manner in which the tribunal has interpreted the VCF regulations, the Trust Act, etc., how far or how correct are these? Over to you, Abhishek.
Yeah, thanks, Ankita. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. Just picking up from where Ankita has left off, right, as she has walked us through the entire judgment, at least the key aspects of it. I think one thing that really stands out is the fact that even though the judgment was really issued in the context of service tax law, the service tax regime, what the judgment did was, from a regulatory perspective, touched upon very fundamental aspects of trust law and trust principles as we've traditionally understood them. And in a manner of speaking, the judge and the tribunal really did, as Ankita mentioned, look at it from the service tax lens, but while doing that, sort of reopened a lot of the principles that were, in our minds at least, established. So what I thought we could do today is, in this segment, just sort of go through some of those regulatory principles and understand the rationale for why the tribunal reached the conclusions that they did, and then sort of analyze them from the perspective of seeing whether or not it can actually hold up in the future, or whether or not these principles and these observations need to be incorporated in our fund structures going forward. So before I take a deep dive into each one of those issues, what I'd like to do is just one key fact which I thought was relevant is the fact that VCF was in this case structured as a trust. And as you all might know, that the trust structure is at least the most prevalent structure that is used for the purpose of pooling money. It may be AIFs, it may be REITs, InvITs, it can be mutual funds, whatever it may be. But the trust is sort of the most preferred structure, and that's why this judgment becomes all the more relevant. The trust legislation dates back to 1882, which really goes to show that it was legislated in a time where the legislators didn't actually envisage the structure and the law to be used for such a sophisticated product. So naturally, the law itself doesn't contemplate a lot of these nuances that are being discussed today, and hence the multiplicity of interpretation, right? So I think we will pick this up a little later on the presentation, but I think this is some food for thought for the legislators to sort of, and the government to look at, is basically bringing the law up to speed with the fund industry, which is growing leaps and bounds, right? Year on year, we see a lot of progress, a lot of development in the fund industry, but the basic and the most fundamental law doesn't sort of seem to keep up with pace at which the AIF industry is growing. And the real reason I am making this point is again goes back to the point that all our fund structures today are governed by trust law. Most, if not all, are governed by trust law, and therefore whatever principles we are discussing today equally applies across not only the VCF structures, but also the AIF structures and potentially the REIT, InvIT, mutual fund, and other structures such as the securitization trust structures. With that, so let me just take let me go straight into the regulatory principles. Again, Ankita has touched upon this in some amount of detail as part of her segment. Aspect I'd like to speak that the tribunal held that the trust was a separate legal entity, which is separate from its unit holders, right? It has separate juridical person and treat it as two different people. And there were several arguments that were laid out. But from a regulatory perspective, I think the that really stood out to us the most was the fact that the tribunal relied on the VCF regulations. And they say that the VCF regulations itself contemplate and itself look at the fund and the VCF as a separate legal entity. And they gave several examples for doing that, right? So some of the examples that were taken were the fund itself was given a registration in its own name and not in the name of either the trustee or the manager. Similarly, it was also highlighted that the trust or the fund was subject to prosecution on its own name, subject to sort of preparing its own books of accounts, etc. Right, that was the first argument that was taken. The second argument, again from a regulatory perspective, was they said that the trust law was a general law and the VCF regulations was a special law. And in the event that there was a conflict, it is always the special law that trumps the general law. And hence all the principles that we have traditionally understood under the general law, which is the principles of the Trust Act, should actually be ignored while looking at it from the lens of the service tax regime. So a couple of points to consider here, right? If you were to go back to the Indian Trust Act and understand what a trust actually is, you'd see the definition of a trust is, it clearly stipulates that it's merely an obligation that the trustee takes on for sort of handling and taking care of the trust property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. So if you really go to see, there is actually no difference between the the trust on the one hand and its unit holders. It's, if at all there are separate legal entities, there is the trustee on the one hand and the unit holders and the trust on the other. The other thing, important to highlight over here is that while the observations were completely correct, right? All the observation examples that were taken by the tribunal were absolutely correct in the sense that the fund was granted registration. What we think is that they fail to understand the actual intent that SEBI has over here, right? SEBI, while coming out with this VCF regulations and very similar with the AIF regulations as well, it intends to regulate the activity of pooling of money as opposed to the constituent vehicle, which is used for the purpose of pooling money, right? So if you were to go and see the VCF regulations, there are a whole host of do's and don'ts on what the fund can and cannot do in terms of raising of money, making investments. But it really goes to show that it's not, the VCF regulations actually permit the flexibility for the manager or the sponsor of that fund to structure that trust, structure the fund either as a trust or as a company. And if it is structured as a trust, it is supposed to follow the principles of the Trust Act. And likewise, if it's a company, it's supposed to follow the principles of the Companies Act, right? So that flexibility is well recognized in the VCF regulations. And that's, I think, the SEBI did not, the tribunal did not take a holistic view of how SEBI really looks at this. And lastly, the observation of the tribunal that there is a conflict between the two laws is something that we've actually never seen, right? Whenever we're advising clients and we're looking at these fund structures, we always look at the trust law as the constituent vehicle and the legislation that governs the logistics and the manner and governance of the fund. And it's the SEBI VCF regulations or the AIF regulations that actually govern the do's and don'ts of how the fund is supposed to be operating, right? So if you look at it holistically, both these laws actually need to be read harmoniously, need to be read together. And if you do that, there is actually no conflict, right? So if there is no conflict, there is no real reason why the trust principles as we have traditionally understood them should be trumped just by virtue of the VCF regulations being a special law. To conclude sort of this one point, I think Ankita also mentioned in her segment that the direct tax legislation and the regulatory principles are in alignment, right? There is absolutely no ambiguity there. It is only the service tax legislation and potentially the GST laws that sort of deviate from traditionally understood principles. And I'll let Amit sort of speak about that a little more in his segment. But at some point in time, at least we think there should be some convergence of all of these principles. The second point I want to pick up was, the fact that the tribunal held that the trust was a service provider. And this is important, and why I want to speak about this point from a regulatory perspective is because this sort of has an unintended consequence on the other structures that we put in place, right? So it need not necessarily be a fund structure. If you apply the principles that the judgment has laid out, it potentially, I'm not saying it will, but potentially can affect other fund structures, right? So what the judgment held over here is essentially that the fund was providing a service to its unit holders, and hence there should be a levy of service tax. And the consideration for that was essentially the expenses that were held back. And the several arguments that were used again, one of them was KYC, as Ankita mentioned. KYC was actually just by virtue of the nomenclature doesn't actually mean that the fund and its unit holders become a service provider customer relationship, right? The KYC norms come about because of the PMLA regulations, which mandate that any sort of intermediary receiving money should conduct this activity. And it is not the fund out of its own volition that conducts this activity. The other point that they really harped on, the tribunal harped on for the purpose of identifying this service being provided argument, was the fact that there are specific discretionary powers given in the trust deed to the trustee and the manager to deal with the trust property the way they deem fit. And these are documents that we have which these clauses in the documents are not only in the VCF regulations, but we write them in all of our trust documents. And the reason we do that is because these are principles that have been enshrined either in the Trust Act or through various judicial precedents over a period of time. And yes, the trustee and the manager does have the responsibility to take care of the trust property, and it has a lot of discretion to deal with that property the manner it deems fit. But the reason why it does so is because it's a fiduciary responsibility which is being placed on the trustee by virtue of the Trust Act, right? So, so if you look at it again holistically, you can't cherry pick some of the clauses in the trust deed and say that by virtue of there being specific powers, it means that a service is being provided, right? If at all there is a service being provided, the service that is being provided is by the trustee to the trust. And in this day and age, you will find the trustee levying a service fee and service tax being levied on that service fee, in relation to the services. So yes, there is a separate legal entity, but it's not between the trust and its unit holders. It's between the trustee and the unit holders. Just to conclude this point, I would like to sort of just highlight that again, it really goes back to the fact that the tribunal has not looked at this entire issue holistically. They have sort of looked at very specific aspects without keeping in mind the overall sort of perspective with which SEBI is looking at it. And one sort of point of comfort that all of us in the industry really get is now that the VCF regulations have transitioned over to the AIF regulations, the AIF regulations are slightly more nuanced, they're more detailed, and clearly lay out the responsibilities of each of the parties, right? It clearly sets out the trustee, the manager, the sponsor's responsibilities, right? So a lot of those sort of arguments can be made if at all this were to be picked up in litigation on AIF structures as well. The last sort of point I want to pick up as part of this subject is, segment is that, the trust paying carried interest is quite typical, right? And the tribunal over here completely disregarded all the traditional sort of corporate structures that we had put in place, and it harped on the need to rupture the corporate veil. So what the tribunal did was it disregarded the fact that the manager was actually playing two roles. One, as a service provider and providing the management services for which there was a management fee. And second, as an investor and a contributor to the trust, and therefore earning carried fees in lieu of the investment that it had made. Now, there were certain peculiarities in this specific case for which it gave the tribunal ammunition to go behind the argument that it was actually a sham and it should be completely disregarded. But just the one limited point I want to make from a regulatory perspective is that if at all the same principles were to be applied to other corporate vehicles. And when I say other corporate vehicles, I would also say, when you have different classes of shares or different classes of interests in an LLP or a company, right? One thing we need to be cognizant of going forward is we need to make sure that documentation is robust. We need to make sure that the actions follow up the documentation in a robust way. And if that is not, then this judgment gives enough and more ammunition to the authorities to disregard the entire corporate structure that is put in place and recharacterize the income from sort of a capital gains to a business income. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this topic. I know sort of Amit and Ankita are going to pick this up a little more in detail, but I think these are the key points from a regulatory perspective that I think we all should sort of keep in mind going forward. So with that, let me hand it over to Amit to take up some of the direct tax related issues.
Thanks, Abhishek. Thanks for dwelling upon the regulatory aspect of the judgment, and thanks, Ankita, for taking such a nuanced analysis of this important judgment. I think the basic premise of this judgment is stemming from the analysis of the doctrine of mutuality of interest. The Honorable Court, I think, got influenced by the flow of money from the investor to the trustee and then the final investment into the portfolio company at a time of the investment, and the reversal flow of money at a time of exit. And I think on this pedestrian, the court tested the principle of mutuality of interest. And as Ankita has rightly highlighted, principle of mutuality of interest only requires complete identity between contributors and the participant. Disproportionate distribution of return to a particular class of unit holder all by itself is not a conclusive evidence of the vitiation of the doctrine of mutuality of interest. Doctrine of mutuality of interest does not in any way tells us that there should be proportionate distribution of return to all class holders. So what is happening in this particular judgment? There is only disproportionate distribution of the return which is happening. I think that got influenced. So the court got influenced by this particular aspect in upholding, rather in vitiating the doctrine of mutuality of interest, and that's why we land up in this particular judgment. I think the court has not appreciated the fact that there is no definition of person per se under the service tax laws prevailing at that point of time, and how the trust is to be treated and how the trust is regarded or considered under the income tax law, which is the most proximate legislation when it comes to the tax laws. Under the income tax law, there is a definition of person under section 2, subsection 31 of the Income Tax Act 1961. The said definition defines a person, and if one were to take a closer look at that definition, the definition of person does not include trust, and that's why we always tax the trust as an association of person, because there is no specific mention of the trust into the definition of person. That's why we say that a trust is being taxed as an association of person, and there are numerous judgments on this particular aspect that trust can only be taxed as an association of person. Trust is being represented by the trustee, who becomes the representative assessee for this association of person. The trustee files 2 returns in this. So in case of a trust, the trustee files 2 returns. The one is for the income earned by the trustee for the benefit of the beneficiaries. That's the first return, and accordingly he also obtains a permanent account number for this type of return, for this category of the return. The another return trustee files in its individual capacity, and there's a different permanent account number for filing his personal tax return. And that's the fundamental concept of the taxation. Now, under the income tax legislation, apart from this particular scheme of the taxation, the VCF and the AIF particularly are given certain concession, or rather I would say not a concession, rather given certain relaxation of being regarded to be a pass-through entity on the capital gains income. It is not an exemption, because ultimately capital gains tax is required to be paid. It is not required to be paid by the trustee, but required to be accommodated in the tax return of the beneficiary, that means the investor or the unit holders. So it is just a relaxation so that income can be smoothly passed through in the hands of the unit holder and can be taxed according to the personal tax situation of a particular unit holder. So there could be a circumstance that a unit holder may be claiming a tax-free exemption there could be circumstance that unit holder may classify to be non-resident and therefore eligible for a concessional tax treatment. And in order to flow these kind of concessional tax treatment, the pass-through treatment has been accorded for VCF and the IA and the AIF. Now, if this judgment were to be implemented, then the impact of this particular judgment needs to be considered for the income tax laws also. So, and the direct consequence of the implementation of this particular judgment will be the taking away of the concessional tax benefit in terms of the capital gain. So currently the capital gains is being taxed at the rate of 20% in the hands of a resident investor and 10% in case of a non-resident investor on the sale of the security. Now, if this judgment needs to be implemented or one were to implement this particular judgment, then the capital gains tax treatment will go through. Rather than the entire stream of income, the unit holder will offer to tax as a business income. And in case of a resident, the business income is taxed at the highest, could be taxed at the highest maximum marginal rate also, which could be 42%, 30% plus additional surcharge and cess, and this could land up in 42 to 43% also. And in case of a non-resident, generally business income is exempted unless the non-resident has a permanent establishment in India. And in case a non-resident has a permanent establishment in India, again, the basic tax rate of a non-resident having a permanent establishment or a place of business in India is 40%, coupled with surcharge and cess, it comes out to 42 to 43%. So one can see there is a drastic difference on the rate of taxes from 10 to /10 from 10/20% on the capital gains to business income at the rate of 42 to 43%. Plus, the tax authorities will also try to recover interest as well as the penalty for the delayed payment. So this is the reason why this is going to be very significant consequence for the fund industry as a whole. Therefore, one needs to keep a close watch on how the income tax authorities are taking cognizance of this particular judgment and further steps in terms of the issuance of notice to the fund industry as a whole. There can be three scenarios in which this particular issue can be taken up by the tax authorities, because we are talking about the past year. So there can only be these three scenarios in which the tax authorities can take up or try to implement this particular judgment. One is the regular scrutiny assessment. So in case the time limit for the scrutiny assessment has not lapsed and under the amended law, the time limit has been curtailed. So it is just 3 months from the date, from the month in which you have filed your tax return, the regular scrutiny assessment can be issued. So that's a very curtailed time period. The second scenario could be the reassessment. So as we all know that a time limit for the reassessment has been enhanced from 7 years to 11 years. So typically tax authorities can issue the tax notice to the extent of 11 years. But there is also a safeguard under the amended law that in case of a prior year, when the prior law was prevailing, the 7-year limit will still prevail. However, the tax authorities will need to adhere in terms of the other parameters for the purpose of complying with the new law. For example, the prior law requires some kind of a basis, some kind of a reasoning for the tax authority to issue a notice. Now, this particular reasoning has been made more objective. Now, it is not all the reasoning by the tax authorities that will come into the picture for the purpose of the issuance of notice. There are only 3 categories under which the tax authorities, basis the possession of the information, tax authorities can issue the notice. The most significant one could be any kind of a red flag which has been flagged by CAG, or any kind of a risk strategy formulated by the CBDT. In case this kind of an information is figured out in these 2 scenarios, then the tax authorities can issue a notice to the extent of 7 years. The third scenario which one can imagine, suppose if your case is pending in any of the judicial forum, then the tax authorities can try to reopen this particular point, although this point was not the subject matter of the litigation, but the tax authorities may try to reopen during the pendency of the litigation at their respective judicial forum. I would say the scope of this particular scenario is also very limited, because that will require the consent of the court also in order to reopen this particular point. And the court is going to take a cognizance whether this is a new information, not already the part of the record, or whether it is already the part of the record before giving consent for the purpose of reopening for the pending litigation. So I would say in case any of the case satisfy any of the above 3 criteria, then it is advisable to analyze the direct tax impact, the income tax impact of this particular judgment in a greater detail. And as I said, that this is a significant consequence for the fund industry as a whole. And so therefore one need to take a cognizance, one need to keep a close watch how the tax authorities, the direct tax authorities are treating this judgment and how they are moving forward with this particular judgment. With this, I will hand over to Ankita or Rajat to take the other nuanced impact of this judgment.
Right. Thanks, Amit. Thanks, Abhishek, for sort of your sharing your insights from a regulatory as well as from an income tax standpoint. While we've already discussed that, and we all know that there would be a major impact of this ruling on the way how we've classically understood the trust structures to be, or how we've sort of functioned so far with respect to our documentation, with respect to the waterfall which the documentation prescribes, the registrations, the KYC norms, etc. There are certain obvious impact areas that come and that would be faced if the department was to sort of lodge an industry-wide investigation, which is a possibility, and target each fund or structures, etc. The first is, like I discussed, that the department in this instant case has invoked the extended period of limitation. The tribunal has negated the the argument of the assessee, which said that that all the information was already disclosed with the relevant authorities. It was the information was already available in public domain, and therefore the allegation that there was some fraud or misstatement or suppression, etc., should not be invoked. That is, and that argument has been negated by the tribunal, and they have still gone ahead and they've sort of confirmed the demand for 5 years. Now, this is something that obviously has a major impact, because if today any fund was to receive this sort of a notice, we will have to go back 5 years, right? And obviously the exposure and the penalty would be higher. Also, it changes the way how we've understood the law with respect to the extended period of limitation. And like I discussed, before, typically extended period of limitation is not invoked, or is not, the argument does not stand if there is an interpretational issue, or if the information is already available in public domain. Supreme Court also in a couple of cases has accepted, these factors, and they've said that the extended period of limitation should not be invoked. So the fact that, the department or the tribunal has not given due importance or weightage to this fact is not good news. In fact, this decision may be picked up by the department or by the tribunal and the lower authorities in all cases uniformly, where the extended period of limitation may be invoked, and they may want to sort of negate the argument of the assessee that there is no suppression. The second is that in addition to tax, when the demand comes for 5 years, in addition to tax, there will also be penalty and interest. Now, this is very important because typically penalty is imposed if there is an offense. Now, if the assessee has a genuine belief, like these funds or trust structures have had, that there is no service tax liability that is to be imposed, then on what basis should the penalty be imposed? And this is something which is extremely critical, because the way the law stood at that point of time, it was penalty was capped at 100% of the tax demand. So equivalent amount of penalty may be imposed, and this would obviously double the exposure, right? The third thing is that, like Abhishek and Amit have already, sort of highlighted, there is an obvious contradiction between the Finance Act 1994 and now the GST laws on one hand, and the VCF regulations, the Trust Act, and the income tax laws, right? So one has to, or this issue that, whether this demand will stand or not is something that will really determine the fate of these, trusts of funds, etc. And really that, right now this ruling has negated or sort of neglected the principle that the trust law, being the most specific law, should prevail over the tax laws. And how much importance the higher level authorities would, the courts, Supreme Court, would give to this is something that only time will tell. The other important issue is that, and this is something which is a straight financial impact for the funds, etc., is that whether today, if the funds were to pay service tax on these amounts, can they avail input tax credit of input services and capital goods, if any, that they have sort of procured in the past? This is because most trusts of funds were not registered with service tax authorities, or even if they were registered, they were really not availing any input tax credit on this belief that there is no output tax liability. So today, if we were to go ahead and pay tax on a conservative basis, would we get input tax credit? Because otherwise it's a double hit to any fund. Amit has already spoken of the impact from an income tax standpoint. Also, it's important to note that while this ruling will definitely impact the fund or the trust, it may also have an impact on the investors who have invested money in offshore funds. And that liability is something that will arise on a reverse charge basis, and which is something that also should be sort of assessed and seen by the Indian investors to ascertain their exposure. Right. And lastly, we discussed that because this entire premise of this decision is based on the doctrine of mutuality and interpreting it in a manner in which we've not been understanding it so far, this may also impact other areas where there is a pooling of resources, and especially when any benefit which is flowing from such pool is as per a waterfall mechanism. Now, the reason why we're discussing these impact areas is because every fund or every trust today is exposed or is faced with this potential exposure, right? And it may be in the form of an inquiry, it may be in the form of a show cause notice, etc., that may come up depending on what all matters, etc., are picked up by the authorities. And therefore, we feel that it is important that we are prepared for this sort of an exposure. While this is not the last word on this issue, but let's understand that if the order is to be appealed, and by the time this order really attains finality, easily it would be 3 to 4 years. There may be an interim stay which may be granted, but insofar as an order on merits, that will definitely take more than 3-4 years. So what do the trusts, etc., what do the funds, etc., do till then? How do they protect themselves against this potential liability? Now, we thought that, given the exposure that we are all looking at, it's important that an exercise is done to review the documentation, etc., to see the role and responsibility, the obligations of each party. This is because this order, or the more than 100-page order, has gone in detail in the documentation. And therefore, if we were to create a distinction, from whether it is on documentation, whether it is on facts, then we should have our pointers ready, that how are we distinguishing ourselves from this current negative ruling that is there, right? The other important aspect is that because if this demand was to be confirmed, right, it will need to be determined that who will bear the brunt of this demand. Would the fund or the trust bear this tax? Because like we know, indirect tax is something that is recoverable from the customer, provided it is documented properly. So it's important that investors are also involved. They are discussed, this aspect or this ruling is discussed with them, and a conclusion is reached as to how do we deal with this liability should it come on the fund. Again, we've spoken enough and more about this. One should always be prepared for any sort of summons or notices which may come from the tax authorities. Typically, it's a ripple effect, which comes up. This is this notice, or this order, as we know, the genesis of this order is from an investigation that was launched by the investigative authorities. And in our experience, if there is an order, if there's a favorable order, then typically, it's just a matter of time before the trust funds, etc., they get show cause notices or inquiry letters, etc. And lastly, but most importantly, given that this is an industry-wide issue, we feel that it's important, given the consequences that it has for the way the industry will operate in future, that channels are opened with the government authorities, a dialogue is initiated with the government authorities, so as to sort of bring out these nuanced points to their attention, and so that any amendment, etc., which may be required to be done in law is done, so that there is no uncertainty. Right now, the industry is in a state of flux. To take registration, not take registration. If you take registration, will we get credit? Not get credit? Who will bear the eventual burden of this tax, etc.? So it's important that we highlight this aspect to the government, and a decision is reached, because for sure this issue, when it reaches the Supreme Court, it will take some time to get settled. Until then, I mean, we are all in a state of mayhem. So yes, that's all that we have on the presentation. Over to you, Rajat.
Thank you, Ankita. Thank you, Abhishek and Amit, for giving us such detailed insights on this entire issue. We have a few questions, so I think we can take those questions now. So the first question is from Pradeep, and he's asking that the AIFs can be structured with even one or two investors, while conceptually it is a collective investment vehicle. Now the fund manager creates the fund for only one investor and also gets units allocated for himself, which will be liquidated against his fee and will offer it as capital gains. Is it not an issue which needs to be addressed? I mean, I'm not too sure what is the context that your question is directed at, but as far as even if it's like if it's one-off investor for which the fund has been created, still I think the judgment applies there as well. There shouldn't be any other difference regarding how many investors there are, but I'll leave it to Abhishek and Amit if they have any other thoughts on this.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Rajat. I think just one point to bring out over there, Pradeep, is that this has been picked up by the SEBI. So the AIF having only one investor is something that the SEBI is looking at very carefully. So it is an issue to be addressed, yes. And whether or not sort of SEBI will look at these kind of structures favorably going forward is also another question that we really are discussing with the SEBI at length at the moment. So that's all I wanted to sort of add in from a regulatory perspective.
Okay, and then we have a couple of more questions on the same lines. What exactly are we doing against this ruling? Is there any representation to CBDT? I think it should be CBIC, but anyhow. And are you talking directly to the government on behalf of your clients? And if yes, what are you hearing from the government on this? So as far as representation before CBIC is concerned, I think there have been a couple of representations made, but those may be, those are mostly at a individual level, and even if it's at a collective level, it will not be through any association. Knowing the CBC and how they function, they usually, they take their own sweet time. Of course, they will take into consideration the entire, the issues which is likely to crop up because of this ruling. But as far as because it's a tribunal judgment, and of course now it's going to eventually be decided by the Supreme Court. In my view, or I do not think that the CBIC will take any step as of now, because this matter is simply sub judice. So therefore, not too much hope from the CBIC on this issue. Okay, so there's one question from Rakesh. Could trust have employees on roll as per this ruling? I do not think that this ruling discusses this aspect specifically, whether a trust could have employees on the roll. So from an indirect tax GST perspective, I don't think this, there is any issue as such, but in case Amit or Abhishek has anything else to add to this question, I would be happy to take their answer as well.
So nothing.
Okay.
From the direct tax perspective also, there is no embargo under the direct tax legislation for the trust to have the employees on rolls. Trust would be required to undertake the compliance just like any other corporate entity.
Then we have a question from Gopal. As investment manager, we raise management fee adding GST, which ultimately become part of capital call notice. So eventually investors are paying GST on management fee. How this ruling is different from such structure? Ankita, you want to take that question, please?
Yeah, so yes, so right now the fee on that is being charged, that definitely attracts the applicable indirect tax. However, the issue in this case is slightly different. It is that the expenses or the carry as we understand it, which is typically treated as a return on investment, that does not attract, or nobody's paying, to the best of our knowledge, service tax or GST on that. And that is where, the department has sort of raised the demand. So it is different. The service fee is completely different, and the expenses which are retained by the trust, those are the ones which are in dispute in this case.
Then we have a question from Saurabh. He's saying, given the judgment, are there any suggestion or preventive measures that are suggested to be taken proactively by trusts, VCFs and AIFs? Yes, absolutely. I think there are, to start off, you'll have to evaluate your structure of your trust, and you'll have to also evaluate the various types of expenses that you're incurring and what is the treatment that you have accorded to those expenses. Once we do that, of course, there are certain other type of structures which can be formulated where, these kind of expenses, which Ankita just explained, can be passed on as an pure agent. Of course, all those things have to be looked at from the standpoint of the Indian Trust Act, as well as from the perspective of income tax laws as well. But yes, definitely there are certain measures which you can take proactively, and to start off, you should do a review internally review your structure and see what all expenses have been incurred as of now. Then there's another question: how will the quantum of service be decided, therefore the consequent service tax liability? Well, as Ankita mentioned, this is more on the expense side. So whatever expenses have been incurred, and because you have not sort of charged them back from the investors, so therefore the authorities are likely to sort of look at what are the kind of expenses that you incurred, what is the quantum of those expenses, and then add a service tax on that. This again is a very, very dangerous situation to be in, because if we leave everything in the hands of the tax authorities, they are likely to sort of arbitrarily and on an ad hoc basis allocate whatever expenses they want to allocate, and consequently the liability might also then rise substantially. So it's always better that you do an internal review and be ready with the numbers and the figures at your end, so that if tomorrow you are asked a question or a notice has been issued to you, then you are ready with the answers. Okay, Manava Prem has asked, considering the judgment, what could be better mechanism to reduce tax burden, both DT and IDT? So as I mentioned, from an IDT standpoint, there are certain structures which you can look at. More importantly, as a pure agent, if you want to incur certain expenses on behalf of the investors, you can do that as a pure agent, which again have to be evaluated from the VSF regulation standpoint, as well as the Indian Trust Act, and also from an income tax standpoint. So this is something which really depends on fact to fact, on merits of each and every structure as to how they are formulated, and then we can probably suggest what is a suitable mechanism to reduce the burden of taxes on such structures. Saurav is asking, since expenses retained by the fund are under the sub judice and subject to tax, what implications under direct tax will be on it? So I think I will leave that to Amit to answer.
So, as I said in my discussion, that in case this judgment were to be implemented by the income tax authorities, the capital gains could be reclassified to be the business income, and a natural consequence would be that there should be an eligibility of a business deduction in the hands of the trust. But since trust has not deducted or would not have deducted at that point of time any withholding taxes, therefore that particular expense may be disallowed in the hands of the trust, and so the trust may not be able to take an alternative plea that since if you are taxing this as a business income in the hands of a unit holder, at least along with the business expense, because the withholding tax would not have suffered by that time. So this could be the consequence in the hands of the trust from the direct tax standpoint.
Okay. Another question, should the trust take registration under GST and claim GST credit for FY 2021 since the audits are getting finalized? Well, if you follow the ruling, of course, you'll have to then take registration under GST and claim whatever credit is there on the input side and sort of use that for paying the output GST liability. So in our view, as things stand right now, yes, you should take registration. Okay, Siddharth's asking, what are the mitigating circumstances in the ICICI Econet case which exist due to the fund being formed in an era where carry and such practices weren't as widely known? Okay, so Siddharth, to understand your question, you are probably asking us to, because at that point of time, the concept of carry was not very prevalent. So therefore, what is the impact of the ICICI Econet case on that? So to answer your question, well, the ICICI Econet case actually has much wider implication than just what is there under this under the judgment which is written by the tribunal. The issues which have been dealt by the tribunal are more on a fundamental basis, which is that how mutuality of interest can be distinguished in certain kind of structures. Till now, if you look at the Calcutta Club case or any other case, they were very clear that a member and a club are not two different parties; they're the same person. But because of this tribunal order, they have created an artificial distinction between a trust and its members, and that is not only going to have an impact on the VCs and the AIS, etc., but it can have an impact on other structures like mutual funds as well. So therefore, even though you say that some of these aspects were not very prevalent at that point of time, but these aspects are prevalent now, and going forward under GST regime, this judgment is equally applicable. So therefore, the tax department at least is likely to come after all such funds who are who have these kind of expenses and raise a demand on them and ask them to pay GST now based on this ruling under the service tax regime. Rakesh has a question, then I think that is for Amit. Didn't understand, if income could be treated as business income, then how expense would not be allowed to a trust?
So as I said, in case if it is reclassified as a business income, then at the same time, for the purpose of deductibility in the hand of a trust, there is a prerequisite that the appropriate withholding tax should have been suffered, or taxes should have been withheld by the trust in order to claim as an eligible business expense. So if this particular stream of income qualifies for the purpose of withholding, then withholding is required to be withheld, because we are talking about the historical period, and at that point of time, the trust would not have withheld any kind of a taxes because we were under the bona fide belief that it classifies to be capital gains income. That's why this kind of a business income or an expense will not be available to the trust.
Thank you so much, Amit. So I think there are no more questions now. And with that, we come to the end of this. Once again, I thank everyone who took out time. Okay, so we have some more questions coming. Asking, are investors will be liable to deduct TDS on the amount they are remitting to trust towards expenses as part of their contribution?
No, I'm not saying that we are required to withhold, rather deduct TDS on the amount of amount being remitted towards the expenses. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, I'm just conceptualizing the situation in case this particular judgment were to be implemented. Only in that scenario, the withholding tax is required to be deducted. I'm not suggesting that we should suo motu do that.
Okay, Manava is asking, how will withholding of tax work under the pure agent concept of charging? So pure agent concept, Amit, is basically, you're aware that where you incur expenses on behalf of a principal, and there it's clearly documented that these expenses are to be incurred by the principal, but you are sort of only making the payment on behalf of your principal and incurring expenses. So the question is that how will withholding tax work under? It's a concept of reimbursement.
Basically. Yeah, it's a concept of reimbursement, and recently there are a couple of tribunal judgment on the concept of reimbursement. So the concept of reimbursement is quite old. It's not a new concept, but I would say the withholding, or rather the fundamentals upon the withholding is still not developed on the concept of the reimbursement. We have noticed the cases where people are trying to route their expense claim through the concept of reimbursement so as to avoid the withholding. For example, if a particular expense were to be made by Indian entity for the behalf of the Indian entity, foreign companies incurring expense and thereafter cross-charging to the Indian entity, and Indian entity is not withholding any taxes because what Indian entity is making a payment to the holding entity is nothing but a reimbursement of the expenses, and there is no income which gets accrued to the holding entity. So recently in couple of judgment, the tribunal has examined this issue, and the tribunal has said that if the original character of the payment requires a withholding, just because you are making a reimbursement of expenses, withholding tax should have been suffered. You cannot avoid withholding taxes just by giving a color to be a reimbursement. However, in case withholding tax has been suffered once, then yes, you can take a shelter of the reimbursement, and thereafter no other withholding tax should be undertaken at the instance of the reimbursement.
Okay. Another question for Amit. We have witnessed funds or trust carrying forward the management fee expense as business loss in its tax return. Can that have any implications?
So it is not, so the management fee expense as a business loss in the tax return, if it is coming out to be a bona fide business loss, yes, one can claim it, but I think so there can be two constructs. The management fees can be added to the cost of acquisition at the time of making an investment into the portfolio entity, and if it is not being considered as a part of the cost of acquisition and being considered as a business expense, then obviously you will incur a business loss because there is no business income which the trust is earning. It is only the capital accounts income or the capital gains income which is earning. So in case you are falling for the latter, not adding to the cost of acquisition of the portfolio company, yes, you can allow to be a business expense and claim to a business loss, but I don't think that trust could be able to utilize the business loss because trust is not going to incur any kind of a business income. They are not going to earn any business income in order to take advantage of this business loss.
Okay, Gaurav has asked a question. Traditionally, ITC credit is being expensed off by the trust at the end of the year. Will you change now that we should keep accumulating ITC until the case is settled? Yes, you will have to claim ITC now, as because as the law stands today, if GST or service tax or GST is applicable, then you should keep on availing the ITC and utilizing the ITC as and when your output tax liability arises. So don't expense it, take it, avail it in your books. Rakesh, if PPM has clause that we will withhold tax from proceeds, then would it safeguard us from this ruling?
Look, in case we are withholding tax from the proceeds, then definitely the direct tax consequences could be mitigated, but that arises a larger question: why we are withholding the taxes? whether do we foresee any challenges in recognizing this as a capital gains income, and thereafter this particular GST issue also gets arises. So if we ourselves is withholding the taxes, then it means somewhere the transacting parties are considering not to be capital gains income, but a business income or a service fee. That's why we are withholding the taxes. So it's somewhere jeopardize our position from the GST standpoint. So from direct tax standpoint, yes, it could be a mitigating factor, but it opens a larger issue of GST.
Okay, so there are no more open questions. So with that, I'd like to close this webinar. Thank you so much for everyone for attending, taking out time, and thank you my panelists, Abhishek, Amrit, and Ankita, for providing us such insights.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining the session.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.